Welcome to Issues and Answers with your host Diane Kinderwater. Issues and Answers is presented as a public service to inform, educate, and better the lives of New Mexicans. And now, Issues and Answers with your host Diane Kinderwater.
Welcome to the program. I'm Diane Kinderwater. At first glance, some of these words we're going to be discussing on our program today kind of look the same. Meritocracy kind of sounds like mediocrity. See the similarity there? But they're whole worlds apart in the difference. What about equity and equality? In your mind, do they seem like they're the same? No, they're worlds apart. Well, in the program, we're going to discuss not just words, but actually the meaning behind these words and what they mean to our community right here in New Mexico, across our country, and really across the globe. These things really affect our lives today. This is not just something in the future, but it's affecting us, and what does it mean to our future? I have as my guest today Jeffery Candelaria. He's a business owner. He owns Connection, LLC, and also he's a radio host and he's an author. He's written a number of op-ed pieces that have appeared in the Albuquerque Journal, and we're going to discuss with him business culture tips. We're going to discuss also industrial psychology. What in the world is that? We're going to kind of do a two-part series with Jeffery Candelaria to talk about things that may be provocative, things that you might have thought about way back in your mind, but it's like, oh boy, Jeffrey's talking about this. And also we're going to talk about how he is a leader and what kind of new leader is that. So please stay with us as we talk to Jeffery Candelaria and some very provocative issues. We'll be back right after this. When I said Jeffery Candelaria is a leader, he's not running for office. We will have an election November, this year, next year, the next year, next year. But he is a leader in what is called thought leader, who is provocative. And if you want to learn more, here he is, Jeffery Candelaria. Thank you so much for being a part of our program and for what you've done in our community for many decades.
Thank you, Diane. It's great to see you. I haven't seen you in a long time, but thank you for having me. I welcome the opportunity to hopefully provoke some critical thinking, cultivate a curious mind, and challenge some of these platitudes that just get thrown around as talking points. So hopefully we can do some of that on your show.
And we have two-part series here, so we have time to go in depth in some of these. But as a businessman here in Albuquerque for decades, you discussed business culture, what this means. We have some tips, and we're also going to discuss on another program industrial psychology. But these things affect us here and now, and I am going to start with those words.
Sure.
Meritocracy and mediocrity.
Okay, sure.
I mean, when I looked at them, I thought, oh, they're the same words, but oh boy, they're not.
So a meritocracy, I wrote an op-ed recently, and I try to personify what that word means. Unfortunately, over the last 50, 60 years, much of our country has just sort of embraced and cleaved to this mindset, this construct that we're victims. You know, I'm a victim because I'm black. I'm a victim because I'm Hispanic. I'm a victim for whatever reason. And so when people embrace that kind of thinking, what it does is it doesn't celebrate individual achievement and accomplishment.
And that's what merit from the word merit.
So think of the military, whether you like the military or not. I happen to support a strong defense and a strong militaristic structure in our country. The military used to stand for meritocracy. So all folks were basically equal, but based on performance, maybe you move up in rank. I went to private school, and I remember that it also celebrated individual achievement, notwithstanding your political stripe or where you were born or your ethnicity. If somebody studied a little bit harder than the next pupil, then maybe that person deserved an A, and the other person who didn't study, notwithstanding their ethnicity, maybe they deserved a D.
Based on merit.
Based on merit.
That's what our country was pretty much founded on.
It was.
Expected. But now, and I said the words look kind of say mediocrity. Mediocrity.
Mediocrity, and again, I'm a Candelaria, so my family got here in 1610, so I'm not some carpetbagger academic talking about these issues. I've grown up in New Mexico, and unfortunately, my next op-ed is going to talk about, does New Mexico actually celebrate and value education? My somewhat provocative, controversial view is the version of Catholicism that New Mexico embraced when Oñate and the Spaniards, particularly around 400 years ago, brought St. Francis Assisi, his interpretation of God. Because keep in mind, there are different interpretations of God even within the context of Catholicism. And again, I'm not getting into a religious construct here per se.
You're moving into education.
But I'm talking about how that influence, which St. Francis of Assisi taught, by the way, he was born around 1100 AD. He was born into a wealthy family and actually celebrated ultimately austerity, hyper-humility, and poverty, which can translate into being intimidated by having too much education. So if you're threatened by too much education, which I believe a lot of New Mexico families are, it's also an affront to the patriarch of the family. Keep in mind that machismo ethic, the masculine, the hyper masculinity of the head of a traditional Hispanic family. If little Jose is too educated, it might be an affront to the father. I'm not talking about God the Father, I'm talking about the father in that household. Further, because New Mexico tended to be very ranch and agrarian oriented, farming, ranching, if little Jeffrey or little Jose is too educated, it also attenuates the labor force. So so all these hidden dynamics contribute to this thing called perhaps celebrating mediocrity, because perhaps much of New Mexico doesn't celebrate education and achievement because it's a threat. It's a threat.
And how?
And no one ever talks about these subtle cultural issues.
And how does that affect our business culture today? How do we see this meritocracy, which if you have a business and your employees say, well, I'm not going to work hard because I can be on unemployment and earn more money, which we've seen over this past year.
Yeah.
How is this all affecting the businesses?
It's a very complicated issue, but I'll try to answer that. First of all, you just touched on something quite interesting. Much of our government, and I try to stay away from liberal conservative, but for the purposes of this limited talk show, I will. The liberal
Limited in time.
Yeah.
Not in our audience's knowledge of
No. Of course, I'm not castigating the capacity for intellectual pursuits by your listeners, your audience. But the liberal wing of the party has basically incentivized much of the labor force population not to work. So when you de-incentivize people not to work, what happens? If you own a restaurant, whoever you is, in Albuquerque or Eunice, New Mexico, or Oregon, New Mexico, wherever the heck it is, and now I'm forced to hire a 17-year-old and a 19-year-old as a chef and a 17-year-old as a waiter, well, what it does is it's actually compromising the service of that restaurant to no fault of the ownership. But that's the unintended consequence of de-incentivizing experienced people who are probably staying home or were eating Cheetos and collecting that additional $1,200. So all these dumb politicians who make these policies, they never talk about these subtle issues which have a profound impact on the execution of a business.
We're seeing that. If you're going out in business, we're seeing.
So let me take that scenario a little further. If you own a little restaurant in Oregon, New Mexico, and your family has owned it for 2 generations, and you've worked hard for that brand, for the culture of that company, but you've been forced to work with fewer staff people, and now you're hiring teenagers. Nothing wrong with that, because you can't get the experienced people to work in there, and people come into your restaurant. Well, guess what? It becomes a mediocre experience.
Yes, it has.
Not because of anybody's fault, but because of the dynamics of de-incentivizing the experienced person. And no one talks about these things. That's
But
what.
we've experienced it. Have you experienced it,
Of
Jeffery
course,
Candelaria?
all of us have. All
we
of us
have.
go out and we see these hiring, now hiring, now hiring. Well, guess who's filling these jobs? People generally that don't have as much experience. Plus, those owners of all these businesses are having to do more with less. So ultimately, it degrades the service,
degraded.
but it's
Yes.
nobody's fault. It's not the owner's fault. But none of these donut-eating fat politicians ever talk about their policies when they're played out and implemented in real life and some of those dynamics.
We're
Because
seeing
these
it
are
today.
complex issues.
We're seeing it today. What can a business do? And again, tell us a little bit about Connection LLC. You're a business owner of this and how that affects our local businesses, what you do, and what tips you can give some of our viewers who may be business owners or are considering that
Sure.
risk, that big risk in New Mexico.
Well, let me preface it by saying I'm not sitting here in some sanctimonious position saying I'm the panacea and the know-all. All I do is observe, and I call out what I see as real-world practical issues and possibly solutions. So my background is industrial psychology. I also worked at the Hispano Chamber for 20 years, so I know something of business. So I decided to start Connection about 5 years ago, and it's essentially what I call a business collision company. What do I mean by that? I collide people together so that they can do business together, and the other word for that maybe is networking. So I put people together synergistically so they can form symbiotic relationships and do business with each other. So I might put an investor together with somebody who's opening a business because they need financing. I might put someone who has experience as a chef in touch with a Epicurean restaurant, and obviously I'm basically filling gaps and connecting dots. That's one aspect of my business. The other aspect of the business that I think is extremely important is I teach people how to own their culture, their nature, their brand in whatever they do. Because branding tends to be a word that gets thrown around a lot, but branding is really, what's the cameraman's name? What's your name, sir?
Ted?
Ted. Ted, his brand is what people say about him when he leaves the room. So it's a very interesting dynamic.
But that's his culture. I mean, your brand could be, I'm the best restaurant. We're the best restaurant. That's their brand, but their culture is not that brand. It's beyond that.
Once again, Diane, you asked an extremely complex question. A restaurant can say on their menus, in their advertising slogans, on their little dumb sign, we serve the best steak in the world. I don't even know what that means. But if they're unwilling to commit to that statement, they're going to have problems. The real answer is the client, the constituent, the patron recognizes, are you the best steak in the world? Not the person putting the steak down. So it's a very complicated relationship between what you commit to as a company and what your clients say about you. That's what I mean about managing the culture and the brand of the company.
And how can people who never consider this start to incorporate culture into their brand, into their business?
They have to really reflect on not just what they're doing, but who they are.
Oh boy, because people just like to say what they do, not who they are, correct? What do you do? I'm a scientist. What do you do? I'm a teacher.
Yes, as opposed to a teacher saying, what I do is I teach, but who I am is somebody who likes to cultivate a curious mind in my children. See the distinction? Now that's a commitment, because that's another thing that I think we sorely lack in this country of ours is critical thinking and cultivating a curious mind. Everything tends to be very absolute. And that's another thing that really irritates the heck out of me when companies say, oh, we give you excellent service. Here's a great example. How many times have you heard someone say, we give you great or excellent service? You heard that before? Mm-hmm. Can they define what excellent service is? 9 out of 10 companies can't define what they mean by great service. It's a platitude.
We greet you within 2 seconds of you entering the door.
Right. Okay. Now you're beginning to define what you mean by your version of excellent service. That's what I teach people. These are obvious principles, but no one talks about these obvious principles.
Give us some tips on how a business can do that. Give us some more examples.
Okay, someone out in TV land over here owns a business. What is their motto? What is their mission statement? Does that mission statement, for any of you that own a business out there, is it congruent with what you're actually doing and what you're living in the business? So you've got to make sure, in my view, that what you're telling the public through my mission statement is what you're actually delivering in real time and implementing and delivering and executing in the company. Because if you're not, there's a gap, and people fill in that gap
with things you don't want them to do.
Whatever they want, and it's usually negative. And it causes consternation, confoundment, and cognitive dissonance. You asked about industrial psychology. That's a fancy word for cognitive dissonance, confusion in the mind of a client. So you've got to make sure that you're managing what you say you're doing into who you are and how you're executing that.
And can you give us some examples of some clients that you've worked with? You don't have to say their names, but how you were able to connect them and what they've said about that, Jeffrey.
I'll give you an example that I think most people are aware of. I don't know that they do as good a job of it as before, but Southwest Airlines 50 years ago said they were going to be a cheap, no-frills airline. They're going to get you from here to there. And guess what? They did a pretty good job of that. So they were establishing an expectation in the mind of the client right away. So you knew that if you're going to go on this airline, don't expect I'm going to get, Chateaubriand and a glass of Chateau Lafite 58. So they did a pretty good job of beginning to manage their culture by saying, this is who we are, this is what we're going to do, and this is how we're going to implement it. So that's an example of a company, a national company, that did a pretty good job of knowing what they are. They committed to it, and over the last 50 years have done a pretty good job of being a very no-frills, we get you from point A to point B airline.
On time,
yeah,
actually. Used to
right.
be before COVID, really.
But do you see my point about
yes.
not just saying it, but living it, and also establishing the expectation for their clients? Because too often companies don't manage the expectation of the client.
What do you mean by that?
We're going to give you great service, and we have the best food in Albuquerque. So somebody walks in there, they're expecting great food and great service, and their food's very mediocre. And they haven't done anything to revise their menus. They haven't done anything to survey their clients. And you're causing this gulf between what the expectation the client has and what this dumb restaurant says they're doing. And again, I know some of this is pretty provocative, but I don't apologize for that. I'm a cynical guy, and I personify that people engage in these kinds of critical thinking exercises and do something about it. Because I'm also about self-reliance, accountability, and being masters of our own destiny. And quit whining all the time. Sick of that.
Meaning stop watching the news, I guess, right? So
I think it's okay to watch the news, but you have to be critical of, even if you're watching Fox, which I happen to watch Fox, and I'm a conservative, but half the talking heads on Fox are just as hypocritical as the people on the left. So I'm very discerning about how I interpret what they're telling me. And I do my own research.
For your our business-minded people who are owners, but also we frequent businesses here in New Mexico, do you see a demise? We see the big box stores, we see the online. Again, you work with connection between businesses and connecting people. What is the future? Do you see, Jeffery Candelaria?
Our policymakers, including our little governor over there, she did what most of the people at the federal level did. And here's was, I think, a very damaging policy. They deemed businesses essential and non-essential. That right there is the death of, how many industries around our country? How many restaurants have we seen across this state that have closed? For a policymaker to deem your company non-essential, let's say you owned a small restaurant, or you owned a theater, whatever, and you worked all your life for that, and the government tells you you're not essential. How demeaning is that? Further, the disincentivizing people not to work. So now you have this labor shortage. Look how you have this supply issue anywhere you go. You can't get steel. You can't get certain kinds of mustard. You can't get certain kinds of steak, whatever. That's an example of the supply chain being compromised for lots of other reasons, one of which is the disincentivizing people to work, and also creating all this 6 feet apart, in my opinion, nonsense. What that does, if you own a huge manufacturing plant and you used to be 2 feet apart making stuff, now you got to be 6 feet. Are you going to be able to produce as much? No. Does anybody ever talk about that? No. All these fat donut eating politicians on both sides don't have the guts and the courage, or maybe even the intellectual wherewithal to dissect these issues. And
what do you see? What do you see now? I mean, we've lived through this pandemic.
Do I see in terms of our country or business?
Business, and we'll move into our country probably in our next show. But
yeah, I think
in terms of businesses,
I think
and
our
tips,
country is done. But as far as business, I think you're going to see an enormous economic upheaval. We're already seeing inflation. Whether you like Trump or not, when he was president, last I checked, gas was about $1.20 less a gallon. Inflation's what, 4, 6, 7, 8%, depending on where you live in this country. So what I see is more hyperinflation, people having fewer resources, lots of frustration. And keep in mind, all these people that were eating donuts, getting their $1,200 a week extra dollars, and not all of these people are lazy, but some of them were, and you never hear anybody say that openly. I'm saying it.
Well, some of them were displaced out of their positions.
Well, yes, what I just said.
Because, of course, no fault of their own.
I just said that. But some are, and some were. Some did game the system. So now what's going to happen when they want their jobs back, and those jobs may not be there because businesses have also learned how to be more efficient with fewer people. That's another dynamic. That's another example of industrial psychology where you actually study the mechanics of a business.
But also prompted people who have had to stay home to shop online, which affects
That's a whole different issue, but to your point, absolutely. More people have done more at home ordering certain kinds of food. For example, the pizza industry all across the country has accelerated because pizza is an easy food to deliver.
Yeah.
So you've had some positives, but you've had a lot of negatives. If you own a fine dining restaurant in Santa Fe, New Mexico, you're not going to order Oscar-style bone-in ribeye, and potatoes au gratin on the side. Why are you going to do that at home? Because by the time it gets there, the temperature, the very texture of the food is compromised. Again, people don't talk about these subtle nuances when they make all these policies.
As, again, the business owner for connection, you have a responsibility to your clients to nurture them, expose them to your ideas of bringing these businesses together.
They're not my ideas. They're universal ideas that I just sort of glean and attach to.
So what is
and
the future? What is the future for connection and your clients?
Well, my business was deemed non-essential because I was putting on live events. So I lost $80,000 in revenue myself. So I'm sitting here upset about what happened to my company, but at the same time, I'm not going to whine about it. I had to shift, and now I'm doing more one-on-one consulting with companies, teaching companies how to own their brand, how to own their culture, how to execute what they say their mission statement says in real life. So I've done that. But what I do ask of my clients is to make a commitment. If you don't make a commitment, it doesn't mean anything. Because life and excellence is hard. Good is the enemy of great. And there's too much mediocrity, in my opinion, in our country and in this state.
And in businesses, if they don't make a commitment. What's their first step to make a commitment, Jeffrey?
Know who they are, not just what they do. And know your nature. If you're a leader in a company, if you're a leader of a TV station, or if you own a restaurant, what is your nature? It's important to know your nature. I think Jesus said that, Siddhartha Gautama, Marcus Aurelius, all the sages throughout
What's
the
the
world.
difference between your nature and your culture?
Your nature is what you're predisposed to be like. What are your behavioral tendencies? People have seen me now for 23 minutes. They know I'm an intense guy, I'm a convicted guy, and a provocative guy. I'm not going to change that. That's my nature. So I position those attributes to be a leader in that area. And if you don't want to be around me, don't. But I'm not going to change who I am. That's the beauty of knowing who you are and implementing that into a business. So when people work with me, they know they better be committed, they better be willing to work, otherwise I'm not interested.
And the customer, with them, right?
Well, the customer's not always right. That's a myth that makes no sense at all. It's one of the most spurious myths out there. The client's not always right. Absolutely not. Just look what we did in electing Biden for president. That's an editorial statement.
In your businesses, they need to be committed to know that they are right, that the customer isn't necessarily, that these business owners need to know that they are right if they're committed.
Well, let me qualify that. What I mean by that spurious construct that the customer is always right, I have to be careful with that because what I mean is, if I own, again, a restaurant or I own a candle shop, and somebody comes into my candle shop and is disruptive and is rude and is maybe manipulating my display,
okay.
Is that customer right? Absolutely not. So I'm going to disinvite him from my world.
Okay,
but
Jeff.
That's what I meant by that. It's like absolutely.
Sure,
I just stay away
That's good.
from absolutes.
That's good.
And be
I like
discerning.
That. I like that. We're going to have you on next time to talk more about industrial philosophy and also some of these op-ed pieces that are provocative and make us think of what is going to happen in our country.
Thank you.
Jeffery Candelaria, again, a business owner here in New Mexico and a radio host, has been my guest. He'll be back, and I will too. I'm Diane Kinderwater with Issues and Answers. We appreciate you watching today. Make it a great week with your family. We will see you next time. Bye-bye.
Issues and Answers with your host Diane Kinderwater is presented as a public service to inform, educate, and better the lives of New Mexicans. To comment on today's program or to purchase a copy of any Issues and Answers program, visit sunbroadcasting.org or call us at 505-345-1991.